Okay, so yesterday we discussed about zones and subzones. Today we will do the lab for subzones and also zones. So we'll begin with the lab for subzones, which is used for limiting the bandwidth. So when your environment requires you to limit the bandwidth, which is used for video calls, you need to implement bandwidth management to control the amount of bandwidth being used. So there are certain ways we can do that. So one is using subzone, and then further over the subzones, we can add pipes which are used for further limiting the bandwidth. So we will see that here. We'll create subzones. We will get our endpoints registered on the new subzones that we will create, and then we will limit bandwidth. And also, as we know that Expressway allows endpoint registration without any restriction. So to apply restriction, one way we saw yesterday that was for the default subzone by applying policy. But for the new subzones also, individually on the subzones, we can restrict access and we can restrict the registration using policies to control the endpoint registration. So we will see that in this lab. So let's begin. So first, let's go to configuration, local zone, subzone. So this is where you find all your subzones. Right now, we do not have any. So we can see links. These are some default links that generates automatically between the default zones and default subzones, as we discussed yesterday. So these are the default links. Then we can to subzone, and now we'll create new subzones. So let's create a new one. So let me call it a SIP subzone. So is there someone joining? All right. So for this subzone, I am naming it SIP so that I can register my SIP endpoints here. Okay. So it is SIP subzone. Let's scroll down. Now, in this portion where you see calls into or out of the subzone, we can put bandwidth restriction. You can see by default it is set to unlimited. So let's suppose I want to limit it to some value. If you use the limited range, by default you will see the bandwidth is 1920. Yeah. So we can change it. Let's suppose I want to change it to 128. That is in kbps. And just create zone. Let's add one more for H23. Call it H.323 endpoints. Or H.323 subzone. H.323 subzone. And here I want to limit the total bandwidth available. I want to change that to no bandwidth. So we'll just see the behavior, what will happen in that case. Because of the no bandwidth, the call should not be successful because no bandwidth for the calls will be available. Let's create this. Now, next, to get the devices to register to these two subzones, we have to go and create some membership rules. So for the membership rules, we will go to subzone membership rules. We have some already created. Let's delete those and we'll create again. New. All right. So first we'll create a membership rule for SIP endpoints. So we want the SIP and endpoints to be registered with our SIP subzone. So name it SIP endpoints. Description is optional. Priority can use any number. Let's suppose 50. So let's suppose I want this membership rule as per the subnet. So based on the IP address, it will bind those endpoints with this subzone. So any endpoints that belongs to the subnet, my subnet IP for SIP endpoint is 1. 32, 172.31, 140.101. So let me put the specific IP just for one endpoint with a prefix of 32. This will be just one IP here. Target subzone is SIP subzone, so that is fine. And the state should be enabled. Create rule. We need one more membership rule that is for HT23 subzone. So rule name is H.323 endpoints. Priority to 51. Here, let's use alias pattern match, and we want to match it exact with the number, let's suppose, which is 4112 in my case, 4112. And I want this to be registered with HT23 subs. Is enabled. Okay, so our two membership rules are enabled. The state should be active. You see it with a check mark here, and we can see the subzones, the type, endpoints with the names, subnet, if there is any, subnet with prefix, alias pattern match here for HT23 is exact, and the string is 4112. So our membership rules are created. Now let's check the subzones, go to local zone subzones. And here we can see each subzone has a membership rule. So it is being assigned to these subzones, which is good. Then next, we will register these endpoints. We need to have these endpoints registered. If not, you can just try and restart. And let's check the registration. We have these registration. We should be able to see these registrations in subzones. Yeah, we can see it now. So we have one device registered with each subzone here, right? Now test a call and then we'll see the bandwidth. So as we have created a bandwidth of 128 kbps in SIP subzone for a call, and whereas in HT23, I have allotted no bandwidth. So the call should not be successful, although the devices are registered. So it's getting disconnected automatically. So that is because of the bandwidth not available. So let's change that here. We will go and change this no bandwidth to, let's suppose, unlimited. In the other end, we have a 128 kbps of bandwidth. So automatically for this call between these two endpoints, it will take 128 kbps of bandwidth. So let's go and call again. It will take some time. Work. For bandwidth, it takes time. Live. Yeah, it's connected now. And if we go here in subzones, We can see the bandwidth being used is 128 because the call is active at the moment. So we can see this here, right? Let's connect the call, go back, and the bandwidth is released, right? So this is how within the subzone, how we can limit the bandwidth. Now we will further implement some bandwidth restriction. And for that, we will have to first check the link. So let's go to the links. Okay, so we could see earlier some default links, and now we have some new links created, which are these ones with SIP subzone, two links for SIP subzone, and we have two links for HA23 subzone. So that are the SIP default subzone and SIP traversal subzone. Right? Same way for HA23, a default subzone and HA23 traversal subzone is created. So let's suppose to further restrict the bandwidth per call, uh, we want to do some changes here or limitation further to the bandwidth we have restricted in the subzone. So that we can do with the help of pipes, and then we apply those pipes to this links. So first, to create the pipe, we will go to bandwidth pipe, add new, name it. Let's suppose SIP to H223. Bandwidth restriction total. So we want limited to 64. Just the half of what we have configured in this subzone. So per call now we want 64. 3, 5. Okay. Now we need to apply this pipe to the link. Now we'll go to the link. Now where we need to apply it, we will have to apply it to the SIP traversal subzone. Why not to the default subzone? Because the calls we are making are between SIP and HA23 endpoints, so it will go through the traversal subzone. We'll go to traversal subzone. Here in the pipe 1, we will select SIP to HA23 pipe that we have just created. Okay, let's just wait a little to get this bandwidth restriction applied. And we'll call again. Let's call. And the call is connected. We can check this here within the links configuration. Here you can see 64 kbps used in the SIP subzone, and also in the HA23 traversal subzone, we can see 64 kbps being in use. That is because of the pipe restriction. It's not using the 128 kbps, which is assigned in the subzone, but the restriction to the pipe. So that is to further restrict the bandwidth per call. Just done. Once disconnect, the bandwidth will be released. Yeah, so this way we can create multiple subzones, create registration for devices separately on subzones. We need to have links which automatically gets created, some default links like for default subzone and traversal subzones. And we can further restrict the bandwidth. Either you can do it within the subzone or you can create pipes, and more than one pipes can be created as well. Now, endpoints are registered, but they are registered as open. There is no requirement of any authentication, no credentials are being asked. So we saw that earlier also in the default subzone. And to restrict that, we use the restriction policies. And this time, as we have the new subzones created and the devices are registered to the new subzone. So for authentication, what we can do in this subzone, we can go to subzones. Let's go to SIP subzone first. Now, under policy, it says allow and do not check credentials. We want to allow registration, but with credentials. Check credentials. And that's it. Save it. Same let's do for HT23 credentials. So now when the devices will re-register, they will be asked for credentials. So see, the registrations should go off and no devices should remain registered here. It will take some time for the re-registration and then be unregistered. Let's just do it manually. But it might take long. So I'll unregister it and then try to register it back from here. Just restart, let it boots up and try to re-register. Now, what will happen because I have enabled the check credentials policy, but how it will authenticate? I haven't mentioned any credentials to be verified. Yeah. So after we have applied this policy in the subzone, we also need some accounts to be created for these users. You can see the registration is on offer. Let them come up, but no credentials are there. So we need to create first the account and then some credentials for these accounts. Then only they will be able to authenticate. So for that, let's go to authentication, devices, local database. So in the local database, we create those accounts. So these were created. Let's delete and create. So first we'll create for the user 4111. The name, password, let's suppose is, let's keep the same as we have C capital, Cisco 1. Create credentials. Now these are the credentials which will be used for the authentication. Sorry. Then once we have created this account, let's create another one for the second user. For two, same password. All right, so now these credentials will be used by these two users to authenticate and get registered. Let's see if these are up. Okay. These are not the credentials we're talking about. These are just login credentials. In some of the endpoints, as they try to re-register automatically, there is a credential page comes up that asks to enter credentials. Here in SX80, we'll have to pre-configure these credentials. So we'll have to go to Setup, Configuration. Check first under Subzones. We have no registration yet because of the credentials as we don't have. So this device is SIP, so we will go to SIP here. Under SIP, you will find authentication login name. Yeah, here it is. So authentication, you have to give the login name and password. The login name for this is as a username 4111 and password I've configured was capital C1 and I'll have to save it. Now it will try to register with these credentials. Same thing I have to do here with HT23 endpoint. HT23. Here under authentication, login name 4112 and password. Let's go save it. Now these should register. And we can see SIP is already registered and HB23 also. Let's verify here under subzones. And yes, the devices are registered now. Okay, so that is it. So these are the few things we can do, how to create subzones, then how to limit bandwidth restriction within subzone, and then to further limit the bandwidth, we can create pipes and apply it to the links you want to apply it to. It can be default subzone if you have like SIP to SIP endpoints or HTTP2 and HTTP2. If it is traversal, then you'll have to apply it to the link that is the traversal subzone link. So these are some steps. First, you create subzone, then you manage bandwidth within the subzone. Either you can create the bandwidth limitation or you can create pipes. And then if you're creating pipes, you have to apply it to the link, to the correct link. Then within the subzone, you can also enable authentication using credentials. So uh, once you have used the policy for the authentication here, you need to create local database with the accounts. So the accounts for the users in which you will specify the credentials, username and password. So it will be done for each user then. So the administrator will have to create the accounts for all the users for the authentication. And same has to be configured on the endpoints to be able to authenticate and register.